American and Atlantic literatures in the Department of English and Creative Writing at the University of Exeter. She is the author of Ireland Migration and Return Migration, The Returned Yank in the Cultural Imagination, 1952 to the present, published in 2019, which was awarded the Michael J. Durkin Prize for books on language and culture by the American Conference for Irish Studies. She's also published Other People's Diasporas, Negotiating Race in Contemporary Irish and Irish American Culture with Syracuse University Press in 2013. And her current research project is For Export Only, Irish Writers and US Magazines, 1940 to 1970. And it's on a topic related to that research. She's going to speak to us today. Watching the Mail for the Amerikay letter, Benedict Kiely and the New Yorker. So, welcome.
Thanks so much for the invitation, Peter, and thank you all for coming. So today's talk is about Benedict Kiely's relationship with the New Yorker, in which he published 17 stories between 1958 and 1976. Before I focus on the specifics, though, I just want to outline some of the bigger picture context for the paper and where the discussion of Kiely fits into my larger project, which, as Peter just said, is titled For Export Only, Irish Writers and US Magazines, 1940 to 1975. So I'll just give a little overview of the project, and then I'll talk a little bit about Irish writers and the New Yorker at mid-century broadly before moving on specifically to Kiely and the New Yorker. So the larger project investigates the following kind of key questions. To what extent was mid-20th century Irish prose, particularly fiction and travel writing, written, sold and circulated in a transatlantic magazine marketplace? What were the financial and other benefits of selling work in the US? Did doing so enable Irish writers to work as professional or semi-professional writers while staying at home? And to what extent was Irish prose written for export only? So I'll just kind of briefly gloss each of those questions. And the answer to the first question, to what extent, well, the answer is quite extensively. Although I'm focusing today on a venue that has received a relatively large amount of critical attention, the New Yorker magazine, Irish writers were publishing in heterogeneous magazines in these decades. So on the left of the slide, there's just a list of some of the writers that I'm thinking about in the project, some more than others. Some make fleeting appearances, some are quite significant. Some of the writers are really canonical writers, be well known to many of you: Elizabeth Bowen, Edna O'Brien, Frank O'Connor, Sean O'Foyloin. And some of these writers have received probably, or have maybe faded out of our sort of critical vistas. People like Brian McMahon, Walter Mackin, Michael McLafferty, and actually Kiely himself, I think, as well. So some well known, some not so well known. And then the list of venues on the right-hand side, again, this is not an exhaustive list, but it does give you a sense of just how widely Irish writers were publishing in mid-century magazines. So the first group is our pulp magazines that later became Slicks, smart magazines, some of the big, large circulation weekly magazines, the kind of venerable monthly magazines, women's magazines, fashion magazines, travel magazines, Catholic magazines, perhaps unsurprisingly, and maybe a little bit more surprisingly, erotic magazines like Nugget, Gent, Playboy, all of which were aimed at men, and Viva, aimed at women, in which Julia O'Foyloin and Edna O'Brien both published short stories. So quite heterogeneous. The other question, I suppose, is, so what were the financial and other benefits of publishing in US magazines? Well, the financial benefits, again, could be significant. I will sort of outline this one example, though I'll say at the outset that this was not typical. This was a large amount of money, and this was not a typical, this was exceptional even in Lavin's own sort of 17 contributions to the New Yorker. So she earned for a story called One Summer, that she's sold in 1964, she earned $5,500 US for just that one short story, which equated to about, in Irish pounds, £1,990. And just by way of comparison, if you were a married man in the Republic of Ireland in February 1964, the max you would make was about £1,300 as a primary school teacher. And I thought that a primary school teacher was a sort of a useful, or teaching generally was a sort of a useful benchmark, because so many of these writers were teachers. Brian Friel, Brian McMahon, John McGahern, of course, Michael McLafferty in Northern Ireland. So at this time, so she earned almost 50% more than a primary school teacher would have earned in an entire year in Ireland. This also compared very favorably with the median income in the US at the time, which in 1964 was $6,600. So $5,500 is a lot of money. I would say, though, that the other it was more typical to earn, I would say, about a tenth of that per short story, depending on the length, of course. So Maura Lafferty sold several stories in the 1950s to a magazine called Woman's Day, and she earned between £300 and £750 for those. Catholic magazines did not pay as well as these other magazines. Not surprisingly, they would have had more limited budgets. So they typically paid between $150 and $300 for short story. The Curtis magazines, based in Philadelphia, so they published the Ladies' Home Journal, the Saturday Evening Post, and from 1946, Holiday, a travel magazine. They paid really well. So you can see, for example, that Sean O'Fwylon sold a story to the Saturday Evening Post in 1968 for $3,500, and to the Ladies' Home Journal for $2,000 in 1969. Playboy also paid really well, well into the 1970s, at a moment when the fiction market was starting to really contract. Playboy was still paying $3,500 to $4,000 for a short story. So some quite good money could be made. The other benefits, other than the money, I think was just that Irish writers were able to get their to access a much wider readership than they could possibly access by publishing in Ireland alone. So there were few homegrown outlets for Irish fiction at mid-century, and those that did exist paid poorly. By contrast, between 1930 and 1940, US commercial magazines experienced enormous growth. During that decade, the circulation increased of many of the publications that became key outlets for Irish writing between 1940 and 1975. So you can see there that the New Yorker increased its circulation by about 53%, Harper's Bazaar by 117%, Red Book by 123%, Vogue by 57%. So significant kind of increases. I suppose not a lot of these would have had circulations in the millions, but some did. So Woman's Day, which I mentioned earlier, that Maura Lafferty published loads of short stories in, by the mid-50s, the circulation of that magazine was about 3.8 million. And you could compare that with the population of the Republic of Ireland in the mid-50s, which was about 2.8 million. So when you're publishing in a very large circulation magazine, you do have a potentially huge readership. So for export only, that turn of phrase is drawn from a 1957 article that Brian Friel wrote for the US Catholic magazine, The Commonweal, which still exists today. And he wrote, when you write for the American market, you must keep in mind that you are writing for export only. This does not mean that you tell lies, but that there are certain aspects of Irish life that you ignore, lest you upset the traditional concept of Irish life which Americans have. So American readers might expect to be entertained by whimsical tales foregrounding Ireland's pre-modernity, which is inconsistent with Friel's own experience of contemporary Ireland. So Friel treats of the issue somewhat playfully here. Nonetheless, Irish writers selling their work to US magazines, and particularly the New Yorker, sometimes attracted envy and disapproval from their peers. So in March 1960, John McGahern wrote to Michael McLafferty, thanking him for sending a copy of the New Yorker containing a story by an unnamed Irish writer. This was very likely Benedict Kiely's The Wild Boy, which had appeared in the 30th of January 1960 issue of the New Yorker. And McGahern wrote, "The story is indeed as bad as you said it was. In fact, it's not really a story at all. Something strung hurriedly together for that fat fee the New Yorker pays, and he probably has an easy wicket. His new novel is coming out shortly. It is unlikely to be on the New Yorker evidence much of an event. Maybe this is a bit mean because it was private correspondence, though it has been published by the Linen Hall Library. But Kavanagh was quite willing, Patrick Kavanagh was quite willing to put it out there in this poem, in his 1966 poem, Yeats. Kavanagh penned a bilious attack on many of his contemporary writers for their obvious success in furthering their careers in magazines such as The New Yorker. I mean to say I'm not blind, really, Kavanagh wrote. I have my eyes wide open, as you may imagine, and I'm well aware of our boys such as Ben Kiely buying and selling literature on the margin. So I suppose just more broadly, beyond these magazines, I suppose the project is interested in thinking about how studying these writers and magazines might enable us to think beyond what has been a very dominant model of Irish writing in the 20th century, so the Joycean model of creative exile, that to thrive as a writer or artist, you have to leave Ireland to fly by those nets, as Joyce put it in Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. And below it, you can see Kavanagh again echoing Joyce's words in the mid-20th century. Nets are still flung to catch the soul as it is born here. One greatly fears that the new one, political freedom, is not going to improve matters. On the contrary, there's a danger that with the outside world no longer challenging, we may become still more insular, more subject to the inside tyrannies of church and state. Kavanagh articulates here a truism about Irish cultural life at mid-century, that it was an insular wasteland stymied by the Catholic Church, censorship, and a dearth of homegrown sustainable publishing outlets. Widely discussed examples such as the Bell magazine, 1940 to 54, are perhaps often depicted as the exceptions that prove the rule. I think, as Eve Patton has shown, there's been a number of scholarly efforts that kind of challenge the cultural wasteland narrative of mid-century Ireland. But nonetheless, I think that there's still more work to be done. And one of the ways I kind of envisage this project is a sort of one as providing one answer to Patton's question: where has the persuasive national label on Ireland's literary output obscured the impact of alternative spatial and political formations, translocal and transatlantic, cross-continental and cross-border, in the shaping of Irish literary tradition? So indeed, in March 1954, Maura Lafferty wrote to her US agent Helen Strauss at the William Morris Agency and used a particularly suggestive turn of phrase about her relationships with US magazine editors. There are a few markets in America on which I have concentrated. Occasionally I write something which I feel is tailored for them, and sure enough, when I send it off, it wings straight to their pages like a homing bird to its nest. So I suppose what I'm trying to do in the project is think about what the history of mid-20th century literature, Irish literature, might look like if it were reoriented around a home comprised of the pages of US magazines. Okay, so the New Yorker and Irish writers more specifically then. I've just put on this slide Irish writers who published more than 10 stories in the New Yorker, ever actually, not just in the decades I'm interested in. So this is a holistic view of the New Yorker, which is about 101 years old, started in 1925, celebrated its centenary last year. So Frank O'Connor, 45 stories in total, Maeve Brennan, 41, Mary Lavin, 16, Benedict Kiely, 17, Brian Friel, 12, Edna O'Brien, 39, going up to 2009. She had a very long relationship with the New Yorker. And William Trevor, the biggest number there, 47. I don't actually look at William Trevor at all in the project because I stopped in 1975, but nonetheless, he's been a very significant, the most significant Irish contributor to the New Yorker. Heather Ingman, who's written a history of the Irish short story, says the number of Irish writers published with the magazine raises the question of the extent to which the editorial policies of the New Yorker affected the shape of the Irish short story during this period. I think it's a very good question, and it is one I'll consider in my discussion of Kiely. But it's nonetheless important to remember, as I said earlier, the heterogeneity of US magazines in which Irish writers were placing work in the mid-20th century. So you could, for example, think about someone like Brian Friel, who published 12 stories in the New Yorker between 1959 and 1965, but he also published cumulatively almost as many, 11, in Catholic magazines between 1961 and 1966. And in addition, The Critic, which was one of these magazines that published, I think, 4 of his short stories, a Catholic magazine in the US, they published 3 of Friel's early plays, which I think probably what hasn't been recognized is the role the Critic played in sort of fostering that transition from the short story to the play in Friel's career. So this is what we miss, I think, if we focus too much on the New Yorker, though admittedly I am focusing on the New Yorker today. It's likely that the New Yorker emerged on Irish writers' radar when O'Connor's work began appearing in the magazine in 1945. An incentive to submit might have been the fact that the New Yorker appeared weekly, and therefore there were more opportunities to get your work in the magazine. It published more fiction than a monthly magazine could include. Before that, many of Ireland's most well-known writers approached the Atlantic Monthly in the first instance. And the Atlantic was a prestigious venue, but it paid poorly compared with the New Yorker, at least by the mid-1940s. O'Connor signed his first reading agreement with the New Yorker in 1946. The magazine had introduced that contract in 1943, and along with its ancillary quantity bonus and cost of living adjustment, this dramatically improved the pay arrangements for regular contributors to the magazine. Prior to this, the rates the New Yorker paid were strikingly low. I won't go into the kind of minutiae of the first reading agreement and everything, but you can ask me about that afterwards if you're interested. Suffice it to say that at one time or another, the following Irish writers had first reading agreements with the magazine: Elizabeth Bowen, Maeve Brennan, Joyce Carey, Brian Friel, Benedict Kiely, Mary Lavin, Edna O'Brien, and William Trevor. Of all the magazines discussed in this project for Irish writing, as venues for Irish writing at mid-century, the New Yorker has attracted the most scholarly attention, initially from O'Connor scholars, and then subsequently, so I think Angela Burke's biography of Maeve Brennan that came out in 2004 precipitated a wealth of, really excellent recovery work on Maeve Brennan. And more recently, Brian Friel's and Mary Lavin's relationships with the magazine have respectively been the subject of 2 excellent books by Kelly Matthews and by Gráinne Hurley. And Yen Chi Wu's short book, Irish Writers in the New Yorker in the mid-20th century, is very valuable for its combination of qualitative and quantitative research on the magazine between 1940 and 1980. Yet the impact the New Yorker had on the careers of several individual Irish writers have not yet been studied in depth. So in my chapter in the book, I focus on Kiely and O'Brien specifically. Obviously here I'm just going to talk about Kiely, but there's still more work to be done to develop a fuller picture of the extent to which the magazine fostered, shaped and/or hindered Irish writing during the mid-20th century. Heather Ingman writes that though the link with the New Yorker might seem to suggest cosmopolitanism, this relationship could actually be regarded as reinforcing the image of Ireland as a stagnant society, since it was the conservatism of Irish writers that fitted in well with the blandness of the New Yorker during this period. Writing out of a depressed and introverted society, Irish writers could do understated irony, but tended to avoid the more extreme emotions and any hint of the radical. In fact, New Yorker fiction by Irish writers is too extensive and heterogeneous to make totalizing claims of this sort. So Irish writers published 190 works of fiction in the magazine between 1940 and 1975. I think another issue with the what Ingman's arguing here about blandness is that it's derived from a kind of gendered framing of the New Yorker by a writer called Ben Yagoda, who's written a very good history of the New Yorker, but nonetheless describes the decade 1950 to 62 at the magazine as the bland leading the bland, evincing a gentility bordering on blandness with not infrequent excursions into the out and out dull. The creative genre that predominated in the magazine during this decade, according to Yagoda, was reminiscence, the locale Irish, followed by English and then American Southern, the authorial gender female. Yagoda's assertion, I think, is itself falsely homogenizing and does not acknowledge the vital role played by individual editors in the fate of a given writer's work at the New Yorker. Indeed, one aspect that I emphasize in the book, though I don't talk about it very much today, is the extraordinary role one editor, Rachel Mackenzie, played in fostering mid-20th century Irish writing. Mackenzie edited 3 Irish writers at the New Yorker, Kiely, O'Brien and Lavin, and thus saw 49 of their short stories accepted and published in the magazine between 1958 and 1976. So I'm now going to move on to a case study of Kiely's work in the New Yorker. I'm just conscious that not everybody reads it or knows very much about it. So yes, the magazine started in 1925, is still going today. And around about the mid-1950s, it had a circulation of 400 to 500,000. So not a mass circulation magazine, but nonetheless a significant circulation. Okay, so as suggested in those earlier quotations from John McGahern and Patrick Kavanagh, Kiely's New Yorker stories were sometimes viewed by his contemporaries as rather cynical money-making exercises. Indeed, Yen Shi Wu suggests that Kiely and Walter Mackin are, he uses the term, main culprits of peddling a version of cute, provincial Irishness in the New Yorker because of their stock Irish characters and because they set their stories in a timeless rural Ireland. In fact, I think Kiely's New Yorker stories are often highly complex meditations on the act of storytelling, on the process by which a given narrative is constructed, and on the mode of that narrative's transmission. By embedding in the stories themselves reflections on the collaborative nature of storytelling, magazine culture, and how cultural material is transformed through transatlantic exchange, Kiely's New Yorker stories can be seen to be engaged in a critical dialogue with the magazine itself. So I'll be talking today about several Kiely boyhood stories, which are invariably set in a fictionalized location that is recognizably his hometown of Omagh, County Tyrone. He was born near the village of Dromore in 1919, and his family moved to Omagh when he was 1 year old. Even a cursory attempt to extract recurring preoccupations from Kiely's 17 New Yorker stories, so they're all listed there, is revelatory. So there are 2 dominant threads, I think, in these stories, often intertwined. The first is a concern with textuality and print culture. Magazines, books, and poetry loom large in the stories, in the folktale transcriptions of the heroes of the Dark House, in the beautiful edition of William Morris's The Defence of Guinevere and other poems that appears in A Great God's Angel Standing, in the poetry Cousin Ellen writes for local newspapers in The Little Wrens and Robins, in the charlatan novelist and his most incisive critic, his housekeeper, in Maiden's Leap, and perhaps most memorably in Elm Valley Valerie, in which the plot Aunt Bridget repeats from a serial story she read in a missionary magazine is misunderstood by the narrator to be about a local woman called Valerie. The second thread is the prominence of the United States in Irish life, literally embodied by returned American characters. So we see these characters in Houses on the Mountain, The Dogs in the Great Glen, Bluebell Meadow, Elm Valley Valerie, or equally importantly, consumed in printed matter, such as the wee books you see in the paper shop window of the White Wild Bronco, the American gardening magazine in Houses on the Mountain, the lurid periodicals of the Wild Boy, and the Mutt and Jeff comic strip in The Shortest Way Home. So it's the self-reflexivity of that last tendency, the importance of the transatlantic printed matter, that I unpick in detail in this section. The link between what is thematized in the stories and Kiely's own relationship with the New Yorker becomes clearer when we consider Kiely's correspondence with the magazine. Kiely experienced financial challenges and frequently asked Mackenzie for updates on a given story that was under consideration, when the next COLA payment was due, so cost of living adjustment payment, or whether the magazine might be able to advance him some money. So while awaiting a decision on a story called The Weavers of the Mill, Kiely wrote to Mackenzie, I keep watching the mail for what the decent peasants used to call the Amerikay letther. The references to remittances enclosed with letters sent back to Ireland by a family member who had migrated to the US. Some Irish stories of the 1920s and 1930s dramatise in oblique ways what the Irish migrant might have sacrificed to send the money to support a struggling family member back home. Two examples are Liam O'Flaherty's The Letter 1928 and Michael McLafferty's The Letter 1933. I suspect Kiely would have been well aware of both of these stories. When Kiely alludes to the Amerikay letther then, he positions himself, albeit only half seriously, as an Irish supplicant dependent on the largesse of a benefactor on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. In another letter, Kiely sought an update on the status of a story called The House in Jail Square, because his own house in Dublin required a costly new roof. Do you know of any sentimental American with a genuinely overdeveloped sense of the past who would like to buy such a wreck, complete with slight dose of dry rot? He inquires of Rachel Mackenzie. He apologises for pestering her, but is hoping that if the magazine were to accept The House in Jail Square, the money might help to keep this place standing a little longer. Sentimental Irish Americans with a genuinely overdeveloped sense of the past are the subject of a Kiely story that had appeared in the New Yorker in an issue dated just 2 days before this letter was written. In Houses on the Mountain, a retrospective first-person narrator recalls the Christmas day his family spent with his returned young godmother when he was 12 years old. The story juxtaposes the impractical but modern house that his godmother and her husband, also a returned Yank, have built on the rough side of Dewish Mountain. So contrast this, quite fancy modern house with a nearby decrepit cottage occupied by two bachelor brothers, John and Thady O'Neill. Kiely explicitly links the nostalgia of returned Americans with the fantasies purveyed by American glossy magazines. The reality of windswept Dewish contrasts with the bright pages of an American gardening magazine to which the returned Americans subscribe. Similarly, the godmother's husband, he has this memory of the O'Neill cottage from his childhood, tables scrubbed white of bone, dances to the melodeon, the best butter in the county, which is very much at odds with the squalid cottage now occupied by the two elderly bachelors that has a battered raincoat for a tablecloth. So Kiely's letters are underpinned by a keen sense of the economic and affective ties between Ireland and the US, and how such ties might be analogized to his own relationship with the New Yorker. While the stories themselves enact transatlantic circulation and transformation, so they're literally sent back and forth across the Atlantic, they also describe and reflect on it. 4 stories, The Shortest Way Home, The White Wild Bronco, The Wild Boy, and The House in Jail Square, foreground forms of play and disguise that clearly harken back to Kiely's own consumption of narratives of the American West as a child. All 4 embed examples of what Philip Deloria calls playing Indian, the long history of white Americans disguising themselves, masking, or otherwise performing as Native Americans. As Kiely's stories and several examples discussed by Elizabeth Butler Cullingford and others confirm, playing Indian and drawing on the image bank of the American West also have a distinct transnational dimension and figure in many narratives of Irish boyhood, often in ambivalent ways. Kiely's recycling of narratives of the American West that had circulated in usually cheap periodicals or paperbacks in Ireland testifies not only to the transatlantic influence of US print culture, but also the ways in which it was translated and transformed in a local setting. The story's appearance in a US magazine adds a further layer of complexity, now modulated with local Irish, Northern Irish concerns. Narratives of the American West are then exported back to their country of origin. The Shortest Way Home and The White Wild Bronco are particularly self-conscious about these transatlantic flows, embedding in their narratives awareness of these very processes. The Shortest Way Home pays tribute to the imaginative power of American Westerns, but ultimately valorizes more homegrown exploits. The story pits two forms of adventure against one another. The first, in which the children's locality offers the richest possible source of intrigue and entertainment. The second, which relies on the structure of predominantly American Westerns to elevate the town to epic status in the children's eyes. The retrospective first-person narrator recounts the short time he spent, aged 5, attending an all-girls school run by nuns. The only girl he likes is Big May, 4 years his senior, who transforms each after-school journey home into an unguessable adventure. Leaving their proper route, they detour through the cosy, smelly, crowded world of the gridiron of lanes, where Big May exposes the boy to an overheard domestic drama. When the boy is unfairly punished by a nun, he insists on attending the boys' school instead, though he's too young, where he's placed under the tutelary protection of 4 older boys. The boys' adventure, a nettle-gathering expedition, draws inspiration from the tales of both the Wild West and Irish nationalist history. The boys apply grease to their boots in ritual fashion, like savages daubing on war paint. Tall Jimmy mounts an old nag and, impersonating Tom Mix, hammers his heels as if they were spurred against the withered, flagging flanks, and hangs from the horse's scraggy neck as if he was a Red Indian. 2 of the boys have constructed a grass wigwam, and when they tire of playing Indian, the boys seize abandoned pitchforks from a hedge and stage a reenactment of the 1798 rebellion. When the boys' game is interrupted by the man on whose land they are trespassing, they flee, and Packy loses the nettles he has gathered. He's rescued when the group runs into Big May. She has an armload and is happy to share them with the hapless boy. Ultimately, the more remote forms of play in which the boys engage fall short of Big May's own mercurial brand of heroism. The girl, tall, wild-haired and ragged, and carrying a jungle profusion of white nettles, is a local hero who is more than equal to the figures lionized in the boys' games of Cowboys and Indians. And 98. The oscillating identifications in The Shortest Way Home. So Jimmy identifies with both Tom Mix, celluloid cowboy, and a Red Indian. The boys play both American imperialist enforcers and oppressed colonial subjects. Confirms Cullingford's assertion that Irish cultural engagements with cowboys and Indians often see the white Irish subject alternately identifying with both the oppressed Native American and the oppressor cowboy, a situation she says argues is complicated by partition. If the Southern Irish are often the cowboys, Cullingford writes, Britain's continued presence in the 6 counties may explain why minority Northern Catholics frequently identify with the Native American underdogs. In Kiely's work, there's a high degree of self-consciousness about the imperialist ideologies that underpin the print narratives he encountered as a boy, both in their original American iteration and in the versions that were recontextualized by British publishers for juvenile readers in Britain and Ireland. In other words, as a boy, Kiely accessed imperialist narratives of the American West via British penny papers with their own imperialist agenda. So in his memoir, Drink to the Bird, 1991, Kiely describes overcoming the boredom of serving as an altar boy by placing the 2-penny pamphlets that then dealt with the exploits of Detective Sexton Blake, or with the more open-air exploits of Buffalo Bill, between the covers of the Irish Messenger of the Sacred Heart, to disguise what he was actually reading. A very similar scene appears in Kiely's 1949 novel In a Harbour Green. Given that Sexton Blake was a long-running British detective serial, it is likely that Kiely also accessed the Buffalo Bill stories via British periodicals, such as George Newnes's New Redskin Library, published between 1926 and 1929, and Kiely was born in 1919. In his second memoir, The Ways Behind Us, 1999, Kiely confirms his unexalted reading at 10 years old. My literary mind at the time was more at home with Buffalo Bill than with Stephen Dedalus. There were also Deadwood Dick and 2 fellows called Hashknife and Sleepy, and eminent authors by the names of Zane Grey and W.C. Tuttle and Ridgewell Cullum and Edgar Wallace. Gray and W.C. Tuttle were American authors, with the former enjoying an extraordinarily large readership in Ireland and Britain in the early 20th century. Cullum, Wallace and R.M. Ballantyne, another writer Kiely read as a child, were British but often set their numerous adventure novels overseas, including in North America. Throughout the latter's work, so R.M. Ballantyne, Stuart Hannibus observes, we can see the tacit assumption of the white man's right to roam and appropriate territory, and persistent contrasts are made between pre-colonial savagery and post-colonial civilization. Neither was so-called native Irish material immune from such cultural chauvinism. Our Boys, a juvenile magazine published between 1914 and 1990, was a periodical much purchased by students of the Irish Christian Brothers, including himself, Kiely recalls. Our Boys was founded to counter the imperialist and Protestant propagandizing of imported British reading material for boys, the kind described and subverted in James Joyce's An Encounter, for example. However, by peopling the kinds of narratives purveyed by its British counterparts, the school story, the Western and the detective story, with Irish characters, Our Boys often just simply substituted representatives of British imperialist power with Irish ones. So I won't go into detail on this because Michael Flanagan has written really well on this. But despite its apparent opposition to the ideologies of imported British material, Our Boys also pervade fantasies of masculine imperialist domination. So as such, the American West in Kiely's New Yorker stories is an accretion of mythologies exported from the US to Britain and Ireland, recontextualized in British and Irish periodicals, and infused with Kiely's own complex subject position as the son of a Boer War veteran and an individual whose entire youth was lived as a resident not only of the six counties, but of the British Army garrison town of Omagh, County Tyrone. So there's a lot going on in, I think, Kiely's representation of the American West. In this context, Kiely's first New Yorker story, The White Wild Bronco, can be read as a remarkable reflection on both the pleasures of transnational storytelling and its potentially malign effects. How the ideologies of a particular narrative transmitted through a print object, particularly a lavishly illustrated periodical, can condition a reader to root against interests more obviously aligned with their own. The opening sentence of The White Wild Boy foregrounds exactly this paradox. At the age of 5, this is the opening sentence, at the age of 5, when asked what he wanted to be when he grew up, Isaac said he wanted to be a German. Listening to stories about the Western Front from his father, a wounded World War I veteran, Isaac mistakes the prominence of Germans in the stories for admiration for their actions. The White Wild Bronco foregrounds a group of townspeople that gather around the bedside of the old Fusilier to hear him recount his experiences of the war and to read aloud the next installment of Edgar Rice Burroughs' The Beasts of Tarzan, 1916. The story's title refers to the local carter's brutal breaking in of a wild but majestic white horse. Isaac is not the only member of the Fusilier's bedside group who was absorbed in the wonder of half-comprehended words. Another, a grown man nicknamed Cowboy, earned the moniker because of his obsession with Deadwood Dick, Buffalo Bill, and Hash Knife and Sleepy. Cowboy has consumed so many two-penny paper-covered books that he pulls imaginary guns and talks in admonitory tones to Wyatt Earp, wears a Stetson and walks as though bow-legged from the saddle. Listening to the adventures of Tarzan leads him to overlay his cowboy persona with details culled from Burroughs' novel, a gesture that echoes the British Empire-inflected versions of American Westerns that circulated in Kiely's youth. So Cowboy claims to have been attacked by an alligator in the US Deep South, where he has never been, just as Tarzan was assailed by a crocodile. So Cowboy has been hearing, the old Fusilier tell this story, read from the Tarzan book. So this is from Tarzan, the Beast of Tarzan, his body trailed out beside the slimy carcass of his captor and into the tough armor of the ape man, etc., etc. Cowboy sort of absorbs this and regurgitates it as if he experienced it himself. My body beside the slimy carcass of my captor, but I had a knife, a stone knife, etc. So he borrows lines almost verbatim from what the old Fusilier has recently read aloud. There's a neat logic to cowboys splicing together of Westerns and Tarzan stories in the context of turn-of-the-century US imperial expansion and large-scale migration to the US. It's not surprising that a new American superhero, heir to the frontier individualism of Natty Bumppo, should be an English nobleman, Lord Greystoke, alias Tarzan of the Apes. Eventually, the old Fusilier himself educates his son about the difference between readerly fantasies and violent realities. He corrects Isaac's mistaken belief that Cowboy was a gunslinger in Texas, telling him guns, Cowboy never saw guns, and remembers his own experience of Flanders and the roar of the Iron Monsters. Years after the events described in the story, Isaac is himself killed serving in World War II. However, the story does not entirely discredit the imaginative power of the mythologies Cowboy has absorbed. During the war, American GIs arrive in the town and seek out the man whose reputation precedes him. Playing along with Cowboy, they wonder whether they previously met him in Tucson or Tombstone. I guess and calculate it might have been Deadwood, Cowboy responds earnestly. The narrator frames the soldier's participation in Cowboy's fantasies as a kindness, because the worst thing you could have done was to tell him he was never there. So the two other stories I won't talk about, but The Wild Boy and The House in Jail Square wear proudly the influence of Mark Twain's The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn and The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, which both assert the value of wildness to boys' masculine development, and which also feature significant scenes of playing Indian. These two stories, I think, are much more concerned with masculinity than with imperialism, confirming the validity of Cullingford's point that the Western does not offer much of an identity foothold for women on either side of the Irish border. So how significant is it that these stories embed reflections on periodical publishing in a venue that was itself a periodical? The New Yorker, a slick, sophisticated magazine, might seem remote from the cheap reading material Kiely describes, celebrates, and to an extent critiques. But as David Earle demonstrates, the divide between the so-called middle-brow smart magazine and the pulps is far from emphatic. H.L. Mencken and George G. Nathan, editors of one of the magazines that inspired the New Yorker, the Smart Set, were also publishers of the lowbrow pulps, Parisienne, Saucy Stories, and Black Mask. The key point is that Kiely gently critiques the ideologies purveyed by American magazines without disowning their seductive appeal. Of course, it's unlikely that New Yorker readers question too closely the complexity of the identifications described in Kiely's Playing Indian stories. However, the sheer abundance of references to Buffalo Bill, Wyatt Earp, and Kit Carson may have flattered an American reader, confirming the United States' global dominance, at least in cultural terms, during what Henry Luce had called in 1941 the American century. Such references might also have had an additional compensatory function. Kiely's elusiveness was profligate. For every embedded Irish folk song lyric or borrowed turn of phrase from W.B. Yeats that might have sailed over the head of a typical New Yorker reader, Kiely also provided a more readily recognizable reservoir of cultural references. Moreover, the emphasis on print culture in Kiely's stories may have struck a chord with New Yorker readers at a moment when the magazine regularly hinted at the impending obsolescence of print in the face of the growing popularity of television, a prospect that was often framed through children's consumption of Westerns on the small screen. So the magazine often, in this period was publishing cartoons that were anxious about the decline of print and the fact that TV might take over. So for example, you've got a man passing a TV shop there, which is offering you, a trade-in on your personal library. Trade in your library, you can get a TV. And the one next to it is just the artist model. He's painting her reading a book, but isn't painting the fact that she's actually watching the TV at the same time. So there's a number of these kind of cartoons, for example, that are very anxious about the inroads TV is making to print culture. And particularly, I think, TV, children and Westerns. I do I do like this one in particular from February 1950, because it depicts the kinds of cowboys and Indians role play described in several Kiely stories, but now features a child playing alone at home and interacting only with the television rather than outdoors with friends, like is the case in the Kiely stories, in a way that perhaps anticipates video games. For a talk of the town story from March 1950, the New Yorker interviewed a toy manufacturer who reported that the previous year there were enough holster and pistol sets manufactured in the US to supply every male child in the US 3 times over, a phenomenon clearly linked to the rise of television. So the first network television Western series was NBC's Hopalong Cassidy, which launched in June 1949, followed swiftly by ABC's The Lone Ranger. Oh, it's not the right slide. There you go. The Hopalong Cassidy and ABC's The Lone Ranger. And in a magazine article about Walter Mackin that appeared in 1951, John McNulty describes Walter Mackin taking back holster and pistol sets for his own children to Galway in the early 50s because his kids are interested in Hopalong Cassidy too. So in this, this TV, this toy manufacturer says city kids have been made more cowboy conscious than ever by all those cowboy movies on television, the toy manufacturer says, further noting that only 20% of our business is in states that have real cowboys. The fact is, the kids don't even play cowboys and Indians anymore. They play cowboys and cowboys. So I just want to conclude briefly by talking about failure. So the relationship between Irish writers and the New Yorker is usually framed as a success story, as indeed it was, but there was also plenty of failure. The New Yorker records at the New York Public Library reveal many rejected stories by Irish writers who were otherwise successful. They also disclose the attempts of Irish writers who tried and failed to publish in the magazine altogether, notably Sean O'Faolain and Brian McMahon, but also including Donna McDonough, Morris Kennedy, Liam O'Flaherty, Dorothy McCardle, Michael McClafferty, Mary Manning, John Montague, Brian Moore, and Val Mulcairns. O'Faolain had at least 29 stories rejected by the magazine, and McMahon had at least 17 stories rejected. While working with Mackenzie, Kiely submitted 31 stories, of which 14 were accepted. And I suppose what I'm going to be arguing, in the larger chapter, is that the fact that Mackenzie, at a certain point in the early 70s, handed her 3 writers, O'Brien, Kiely, and Lavin, on to other editors at the New Yorker, ultimately had a big impact on the futures of Lavin and Kiely in particular at the magazine. Edna O'Brien was handed over to Frances Kiernan, who was quite a sympathetic editor. But there was Kiely and Lavin were handed on to first Derek Morgan and then Charles Chip McGrath. The other major change at the New Yorker in the mid-70s was that they introduced a mandatory retirement policy. So there was a clear out of editors. And so some of the kind of priorities of the magazine over the previous few decades began to change. And so, for example, Reminiscence, the short story that was very indebted to childhood reminiscent, of which Frank O'Connor published many, and Kiely also published several, that declines in popularity after this kind of editorial shifts and changes in the mid-70s. It appears that Kiely's work fell out of favour in the 70s, at least partly because of the new direction the magazine took during that decade. The rejections of Make Straight for the Shore and Near Banbridge Town, I think, are revelatory in this respect. So Make Straight for the Shore was actually a kind of continuation of some of the boyhood narratives he published. It's about 3 young men who've just finished school who go to Belfast to take the civil service exam. And some of the characters, some of the teacher characters actually exist in some of those boyhood narratives that Kiely published successfully in the New Yorker in the late 50s. But by now, Charles McGrath's writing and saying, we liked it and everything, but I'm afraid we all felt that it was just too rambling and sentimental for us. When Kiely, so he found that the magazine had moved on from the kind of reminiscence genre. He also, when he tried to submit more experimental material, so near Banbridge Town, is actually a very complex, picaresque tale. It's very dense. When he submitted material like that, he found the work, it was admiring, the feedback was good, but it also did not quite make the cut. So as I say, one of the things I want to explore in the larger chapter is the central role played by Mackenzie, and whether two out of those three Irish writers lost their champion at the magazine once she moved on. But I'll leave it there for now. Thanks.
There will be questions. People online, if you want to ask a question, either type your question into the text box or raise your hand electronically, and Michael will let us know that you want to ask a question. But for people in the room, just do the normal thing. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. That was absolutely genuinely fascinating. And I mean, I'm sure you saw that review of the new selection of Mary Lavin over the weekend.
The new selection of
Mary Lavin's story.
Oh, okay.
Which actually
Yep.
makes the point that because she's being in the page of New York is a very rare thing, and the project isn't going to be timely with comments like that still being made. But what I wanted to pick up on was what you said at the end about editorial shifts, and I mean, obviously the financial prospects and the readership prospects are incredibly attractive to any kind of writer. But I mean, one of the things with the New Yorker in particular, which does potentially lead to those challenges of brothers, is actually the editorial care that writers receive. And I wonder if how much of an attraction that was, simply to have people who really were interested in what you were trying to do.
That is, yeah, that's absolutely right. So, I mean, Catherine S. White, who was at the New Yorker almost from the outset, handling fiction and poetry, but mostly fiction, she pioneered the editorial letter, what she called the personal editorial letter, which wasn't just a straight rejection or a one-line rejection, but a very generous, kind of lengthy feedback, even when they were rejecting a story. Yeah, you know, so these were not like just one-line responses. And then obviously with work that they liked but felt was limited, or needed work or whatever, they also worked very carefully with the authors. And Mackenzie with Kiely used to engage in what she called speculative editing. So if a story came to her from Kiely, she did this with at least 4 or 5 of his stories. If a story came to her and she felt it wouldn't be passed by her fellow fiction editors, she would edit it herself speculatively, then give it to her fellow editors and see if it passed muster. And then she presented Kiely with the changes that she had made to the story. And she said, you know, no pressure. You don't have to accept these changes, but here's a check in case you want, you know, in case you are interested in accepting these changes. So it's a sort of an interesting question about like the money and the reliance of the, you know, but ultimately, I didn't put it in today's presentation. You can do a line by line comparison between the submissions, some of these Kiely submissions, the version published in the New Yorker and the version he subsequently published. And he did maintain many of the edits that she made. So I think a lot of these writers really appreciated, as you say, the care that they got and the attention and the labor that these editors were putting in. Yeah.
Yes. So
they submitting each of these short stories separately, and I'm just thinking by the time that it takes to send it back, like to and fro Ireland and America, or so that were they sending kind of batches of them, or are they going kind of individual, and it just takes say a month to go back and forth?
Yeah. So some of the writers were submitting through American agents. Kiely at this point in the late 50s was not. He was actually sending them directly to Mackenzie. And one of the things, side note, the Irish writers were talking to each other. The very first letter that Edna O'Brien sent to the New Yorker, she said, "Dear Rachel Mackenzie, Benedict Kiely gave me your name and suggested I write to you." So some writers were submitting through US agents, so that was So they would send the story to the agent first, and then the agent would. But no, they weren't sending in batches. They were sending them as they were completing the stories. And so there might be a long gap if they were working on a novel or something else, or if they happened to be just writing a lot of stories at once, they would come in quite quick succession. The rejections and or acceptances came quite quickly from the New Yorker. They turned the stuff around unbelievably quickly, like within a few days or a week. So even though there was the lag of the transatlantic post, the New Yorker wasn't sitting on the material for a long time. So the delays were caused by the post rather than the New Yorker. They were turning the stuff around very quickly.
Like where the idea for this research came from?
Can I pinpoint? I was already working on magazines. Actually, I'd published an article about an African-American writer called Anne Petrie, who published a short story that she was the first African-American woman to publish a short story in the magazine in the late 50s. And then the pandemic came, and I was like, what am I going to do? You know, archives, I'm an Americanist by training, and all my archives are in the US. And I started thinking about archives that were in Ireland, Maura Lafferty's, Benedict Kiely's, Brian Friel's. So I was able to start a new project by working with archives in Ireland. And I discovered the Lafferty stories first, and they had not been. Maura Lafferty published loads of short stories in this magazine, Woman's Day, in the 1950s, and no one had ever discussed them before, and all her papers are at the National Library of Ireland. So that was really where it started. I started working on the Lafferty stories first, and then I realized there was probably a project in there, a book.
Thanks, that was great. I was interested in what you're saying about how some of the ways in which Ireland is depicted in these stories is quite conservative, or conceived to be conservative. One of the things I was thinking about is the impact of censorship, and not in the sense of that writers couldn't say something, but creating a kind of a climate of mediocrity where there wasn't really publication outlets, and there wasn't maybe an interest in good writing, and it wasn't kind of encouraged. And, you know, if you look at some of the memoirs of writers in this period, they do portray a very kind of characterist arm, which is a sort of an atmosphere which is just sort of opposed to a kind of intellectual endeavor, and the writer being very much marginalized and looked down upon. So those kind of things, do they kind of feed through then in terms of how some of the writers engage with contemporary Ireland and so on? Or because I presume, like, on some level this must be quite different to be a writer living in that kind of in Ireland, albeit, you know, the main factor was that it's been shaped in this commercial. It was never going to be well-paying Irish journals, presumably, giving writers this kind of living. But on the other hand, they're still living in this, you know, pretty repressive climate.
So thank you. Yeah, that's a really good question. I think although I'm very interested in the New Yorker, I think the most fascinating bit of this research for me has been the US Catholic magazines, because there were Catholic writers who were being banned in Ireland, who were being celebrated in these US Catholic magazines. And, you know, there's a short story, you know, by Brian McMahon, you know, that appeared in a magazine called St. Jude, which I mentioned earlier, a Catholic magazine, which is quite sexually suggestive. And they published it. And then he had published another story, which was about mother and baby homes. And they published that, and it had been declined by loads of women's magazines in both the US and Britain, because they didn't like stories about illegitimate motherhood. So I would say that has been one of the most interesting things, is that some fairly devout writers, like Michael McLafferty was a very devout writer, actually, found outlets for their work in the US, and a more permissive Catholic publishing. You know, so publishing in general was more permissive in the US, but even the Catholic magazines were more permissive. And they were delighted to have Michael McLafferty, Brian McMahon, Kiely publishing in their magazines. On the New Yorker, I will say that the New Yorker had a reputation for being quite puritanical about what it would include. So certainly by some of these stories that Kiely is having rejected by the late 60s, early 70s, he was writing to his agent at Curtis Brown, New York. Well, he had a first reading agreement, so it had to go to the New Yorker first. They had to have a first look, but he was like, send this to the New Yorker. I know they won't accept it because it's too rude, it's too bawdy. They're not, they're not going to like it. And indeed, they'd send back a letter saying, this is just an elaborate toilet joke, no thanks. So the New Yorker was quite puritanical, but I think, yeah, for me, one of the most interesting things is how welcoming the US Catholic magazines were of some of these writers.
It's fantastic, Sinead, thank you so much. I think quite often about the short story as a form and its relationship to the novel. It's not frequently positioned or dismissed as a junior form and sometimes as a younger sibling to the novel. Is there something there for you about boyhood and selfishly related to my own research and form in these short stories?
It's a good question. I mean, I think one of the things I'm very conscious of, because I'm focusing exclusively, because of the nature of the project, I'm focusing exclusively on the short story and other short prose forms like travel writing, is the sheer number of novels that some of these writers published, including Kiely. So I don't know how to answer that question really. Certainly the writers didn't view the short story as a juvenile form or and they were often pressured to write novels because novels were more commercial. So their agents would be sort of saying, oh, thanks, for the short story. But, we'll have they would always, agents were happy to deal with short stories because they could command quite a lot of money individually, but a collection of short stories was never really welcomed by an agent. They always wanted the novel. So there are commercial pressures there. I don't know how to answer that question really. I don't think the writers thought of the short story as a sort of a juvenile or apprentice type of form. Because Kiely, for example, obviously wrote all those novels and went through phases with the short story. He'd write quite a number in the space of 3 or 4 years, and then he'd devote his time to the novel maybe, and then he'd go back to the short story, but he never abandoned it.
Sinead, yes.
Thank you.
Manuscripts that you mentioned that Rachel Mackenzie and other editors might have made, are these all sort of preserved and kept in the, are they conscious of going in archive?
Well, the New Yorker archives, I mean, basically the finding aid is 900 pages long. So no, like it's all done by year in alphabetical order. So, you can look at the correspondence, which is by year in alphabetical order, and then you'll have to go and look at the copy and source files. The edits that say Mackenzie made to Kiely's work are only possible to carry out because the original submissions are at the National Library of Ireland. So the kind of original, so if the New Yorker accepted, if the New Yorker rejected a piece, they sent it back to the author. That was the end of it, or to the agent, and that was the end of it. They didn't hold a copy. So those are all the rejections are not in the archive. If they accepted a story, they had it retyped, and then they made edits to it. And so you can look at those copy and source files, but they're completely separate from the correspondence. It's a huge archive. And so yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Thank you.
I'm thinking about one of those other well-worn tropes of 20th century Irish literature, and it's the study of, which is the Irish writer in exile, Joyce and Beckett. And I'm just wondering if this project really pushes back and complicates that preconceived notion that Irish writers always leave or have to leave. There's something I'm only thinking about this because I'm wondering if American magazines are, re-roofing Dublin worship houses. To what degree does this project maybe suggest a certain kind of stabilizing or relocating of Irishness in Ireland?
Yeah, I mean, it's not that was kind of one of the motivating kind of intellectual questions for me is, because I've always in the past written about Irish migration, people leaving Ireland and return to Ireland. But I did really want to trouble that idea of Ireland being this kind of wasteland. And I also wanted to kind of show writers who made careers for themselves, and they didn't all, like Michael McClafferty obviously spent his whole career as a teacher. So did Brian McMahon. But Brian Friel gave up teaching in 1960, partly off the back of this New Yorker first reading agreement, which actually did place him under quite a lot of financial pressure. So that's, I think, another thing for me to consider is, that, and also Kiely's, the American letter, like that kind of supplicant, the Irish supplicant, dependent on the largesse of a benefactor. But yeah, I wanted to think about writers who made careers for themselves without leaving Ireland. But I don't want to insist on that too much, because one of my writers is Edna O'Brien, who lived in England from 1958 and, really made a big, really sort of broadcast the idea of needing to be in exile in order to be a writer. So I don't want to insist on it too much, but I do want to show Irish writers earning decent money and being able to stay in Ireland. I think Friel would be a good example of that. And Kiely would, although he spent periods in the US teaching, but he basically lived in Ireland.
Sinead, is there any significant market for the New Yorker and the other journals in Ireland itself? I mean, are the stories coming back across the Atlantic? And if not, do you, Kylie and your other writers, rework any of these stories for a specifically Irish audience through Irish publishers?
Oh yeah, yeah. So the New Yorker would have been one of a select number of publications that was distributed at, let's say, Eason's booksellers and things. The Ladies' Home Journal, the New Yorker, some of the more famous big magazines in the US would have been familiar here, but I wouldn't have thought they'd have had a wide readership. The Catholic magazines would have circulated in Ireland, and Irish Catholic periodicals were indexed in the American Index of Catholic Periodical Literature. So in other words, the Catholics were really organized in terms of those transatlantic connections. Yes, so Irish writers would often resell the story in Britain or Ireland. And in fact, so what you were doing was you were selling first North American serial rights in the US and Canada. And then once it had appeared in print in the US, you were free to sell it on in Britain or Ireland. So many of them republished the work. I mean, one of the problems was that some of these writers weren't particularly organized. So like Maura Lafferty, often her British agent would be like, so when is this coming out in the US, and can I really sell it to a British magazine, or like, and so there was some lots of errors are made, but nonetheless, yeah, you could resell it in Britain, and they did, and made more money that way. But the real money was made in the US, so they always went for a US sale first, and then a British sale or an Irish sale.
Great. Do we have any last questions? No, well, thank you very much, Sinead. This is fascinating material, and we will be waiting for export only to appear in due course when it's ready to appear. That'll be fascinating.
Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for all your.
Can we thank Sinead for? So we have another seminar next Monday, same time, 4:30. We have Melissa Baird, late of this parish, and Michael Kennedy from the Documents of Irish Foreign Policy project. They're currently working on the 1974 to 1977 volume, so they will be coming and speaking about the response of the Department of Foreign Affairs to the collapse of the Slingdale Agreement, the collapse of the Borsberg executive in 1974, and how the Irish Department of Foreign Affairs deals with that. So come and join us next Monday if that's of interest. Otherwise, thank you very much for coming.